considering what video I wanted to put out on the 17th. That's the premiere I do when I'm not doing a live. Well, I couldn't think of anything more interesting than the fourth rates. And so here it is. The question is, when is the fourth is both not enough and too much? I adapted the question myself. Because the basic problem for the fourth rate is similar to that of the 10-inch gun. It sits there in its figures in terms of battleship guns and cruiser guns, and it looks like it's at the perfect point. You know, it's heavy enough, it's battleship grade, but it's small enough, it should be, you know, fast enough rate of fire. The trouble is, as heavy as it is, as small as it is, anything above a 9.2 inch, 9.4 inch, depending on the area, has pretty much the same rate of fire as a 12 to 14 inch gun. Pretty much the same rate of fire as you can get from a 12 to 14 inch gun. So, 10 inch, under that circumstances, why? You get the same rate of fire out of a 12 inch gun, and it's going to be a far bigger hit. A far bigger hit. It's not enough force for the line, and not enough numbers for the cruising. What does that mean? Well, it means, frankly, a fourth rate would always be beaten by a third rate in a fight in a line of battle. And it was too expensive to produce in numbers to do the frigate duties. So why did they still exist? We'll get into all this in detail, but in short, they still exist because they fill a niche. It's one of those interesting things. You start talking about the small cruisers of the World War I era, the destroyer leaders and scout cruisers, and people look at you and go, that came from, that was a really innovative idea they came up with, that they needed a slightly larger ship, or a slightly smaller cruiser, which could do the flagship duties for those destroyers. And someone like me will be looking at you and going, that was a fourth rate. It was. You could theoretically go through the ground fleet and you could divide it up quite consistently into first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth rates. Or the fleet at Ballard Jutland fleets. You probably put... And, well, that is certainly an option. That is certainly an option to do that. I thought I'd start off this one about the fourth rates by looking back at the previous video I've done about the fourth rates, because it seemed like a good area to start. It seemed like a sensible area to start. With the fourth rates having been a pretty interesting video I did a while back, and being something I consistently thought about since. And thought about thinking about, what are we going to put into a key ships when I do this? Because many of the videos that have come out, comments that have come after that was going, oh, I'd love you to do a key ships profile of these classes, of these ships. And I went, of these groupings. Yeah, I can do that. And so we started, and I started off with the first rates, and the second rates, and the third rates, and now I've reached the fourth rates again. And I thought, well, do I just leave it as the video that has been done? Or do I do another video about it? And I thought, well, I'd like to use a similar starting off point, hence the recording being used. I'd like to use a similar starting off point, but I'd like to move on from there. And the things I'd like to move on through basically move me to this, the 6 rates. And technically it's actually 7. See, for a rated ship, it means you're rated to have a captain. 7th, a captain as captain. So, and you normally would have, in most cases, a sailing master as well. But for anything below a 6th rate is unrated, and that's usually where we get things like brigs and other ships which are called where the officers in charge are often called masters and commanders. And so theoretically you have 6 defined ratings, and anything below that is in an unrated mess. It's not realistically, but it is. And so that makes it 7. Realistically, 7 sorts of ratings. In which case 4 definitely is in the middle. Now, if you think about it, and in terms of how we normally apply things, normally going for the middle, going for the average, is a fairly good idea. Especially when you're looking at mass production, especially when you're building a viable force and a viable structure, because normally the middle represents the best value for money. In enough quantities, they can fight the high-end gear, and you can build them in enough numbers that the low-end gear can't outmass you. It can't as easily go all over the place. And sometimes the middle is a very good, important mix of a true formation. We often talk about the high-low mix, but honestly, realistically, historically, it's a high-mid-low mix. In that you're going to have a large volume of low, you're going to have a core of high, and there's probably going to be sitting in between a further group of mid. Well, the thing is, it doesn't work like that always when you're talking about warfare. Because the trouble is, a 4th rate on paper is a great asset. In practice, it's just not that good at anything. And whilst warships do tend to be bought in large numbers as generalists, they usually have an emphasis, a specialism, which is their selling points that gets them bought in large numbers. And the thing is, if I want a frigate, well, the better option for a frigate is the 5th rate. I can design it to be more flexible, I can support it over longer ranges, I can produce more of them, slightly cheaper, all those things. If I want a ship to fight in the battle line, well, the 3rd rate has got that solid, because let's be honest, a 4th rate is not matching up, no matter how many you're talking about, to a 1st rate. But most 3rd rates can stand toe-to-toe with 1st rate and hold their line for just about long enough for help to arrive. Or if there's a pair of 2 or 3 of them, take that 1st rate down like a pack of hungry wolves. There are several battles in history where they did that. Ravenous hungry wolves. But you can't do that with a 4th rate. Trust me, nations tried. There are a fair number of fleets in Europe, etc., from medium to lower powers in this period who basically have 4th rate navies. Their fleet is heavily 4th rates. Heavily made up of 4th rates. Because they can afford them, because they make sense in the shallow waters of the Baltic, etc. And when they have a fight with the Royal Navy, a full fleet confrontation, as a rule, what the Royal Navy does is bring its minor horde of 3rd rates along and goes, tally-o, boys. So the question is why? Realistically, a 4th rate and a 3rd rate both have 2 decks. They both have 2 gun decks. Yes, the 4th rate has less guns, but you know their weight, it depends on the individual ship and individual design more than anything else. Why is it such a curb stomp in a fight? I think the answer is in the way it works. When you're talking about a complement of guns greater than 30 to 50, and as time goes on, maybe 40 to 60. That's a fair amount of guns. And if you are facing off against a 64 and you are a 50 gun ship well, the odds are they're going to have 8 more guns per side than you. It's not going to make a difference. But then what happens if you're facing a 74? That'll be 12 more guns per side than you. That starts to add up a bit. And that's a longer ship with a better length to beam ratio for the kind of operations a ship of the line is going to be called upon to do. So the problem is, what should be the perfect sitting in the middle, we can build a lot of mass here and we can give ourselves a very strong position to play off from, doesn't actually fit with navies. And this might be why this is what happens, because the classic example is you have 8 first rates in service, 7 second rates in service, 103 third rates in service in 1814, and 10 fourth rates. There's actually a period in 1794 when there are more second rates in the service for the Royal Navy than there are fourth rates. They are considered that niche. That you are more likely to find a second rate in the Royal Navy than you are to find a fourth rate. Depends where you're operating now. Baltic, well, the trouble is, again, there, you tend to find the Royal Navy likes to send the 64s. They're a third rate. They might be the base level of a third rate, and if you were finding yourself dealing with a 60-gun fourth rate, well, you know, 64 doesn't have that much of a firepower advantage. But yeah, they do have something. They do have something. And you look down and you start going through and thinking, well, hang on. There are 25 sixth rates in service. Or rather, frigates or post ships, sixth rates, sort of 20 to 24 gun ships. And they're in service in 1814. If we think about that, that's the same number as 4th, 1st, 2nd and 4th rates combined. Compared to the 237 3rd and 5th rates. This is why I love it when people tell me the Royal Navy's always been a first-rate navy. No, it wasn't. In the 1800s and 1700s, it was a third-rate navy and proud. And so was everyone else who was sensible. And I know someone's going to sit there and go, well, you know, they had the best cannon available, the best rope quality available, the best this and best that available, which makes them first-rate navy. And you're right, they are a first-rate navy, but they're building third rates. Because you're never going to have the numbers concentrated trying to build first-rate ships. You'll never have the fleet you require if you want to build first-rate. If you try and build everything to your first-rate ships, you will never have the numbers you need. Look at that core. The core of the Royal Navy was 15 ships in 1814. In the Napoleonic Wars. 8 first rates, 7 second rates. That's it. That's the fighting core. They are wrapping 103 third rates around. 103 third rates. Very nearly 7 third rates for every one of those major ships in commission. Very nearly. 2 ships off. 2 ships off that. And yet there are 10 fourth rates. Okay. It's also like when, you know, anyone starts to say, but my, you know, for want of frigates, England will be lost and all these sort of things. So there and go, well, the Royal Navy at that point had 134 great frigates or frigates in terms of the 5th rate category, 25 post ships, so that's taking us up to, what, 159, and 360 other vessels. 360 other vessels. Which makes it 500 and... well, I think 19. 519 other ships below that level. And the Royal Navy still didn't have enough. It's the ultimate proof that it doesn't matter how many small ships you have, how many small boats you have running around and doing all the duties you do, you will never have enough. In the age of sail, when you're dealing with the fleet scenarios you're dealing with then, the Royal Navy has 519 vessels out of a total fleet of what? 600, add on 28, 619, 28, 638, 647 ships. And still there's not enough to go around. I mean, you can make the claim they needed more. You can't make the claim they weren't trying their best. And in that all that force, there are 10 fourth rates. 10 of them. So, if they are really not worthwhile in the schemes of things, compared to third rates for being ships of the line and fifth rates for being frigates, why, in all the name of all things holy and steel and steamy, do they build them? You can understand why powers like the Dutch and Baltic navies would build them. They make a lot more sense in the shallow waters. You can understand why they have a force. But why does the Royal Navy have such a force? Why does it need them? And the answer, realistically, is foreign stations and the Baltic itself. The Royal Navy always needs some for dealing with potential threats in the Baltic. And a fourth rate is a useful vessel for having in foreign territories. And there are two reasons it's useful. One, if they know the Royal Navy does have fourth rates, then if they see an East Indiaman, which is a merchant ship belonging to the East India Company, both the Dutch and the British English East India Companies have very similar ships. Well, if they know you have fourth rates in service and they're painted right, they can do a partial imitation of a fourth rate. They can't really pretend to be a third rate. They don't have enough rigging. They don't have enough presence. But they can pretend to be a fourth rate. And that could buy enough time, because if you're a raiding squadron and you see a force coming towards you, you're not sure if they're all fourth rates or if they're a mixture of fourth rates and East Indiamen, and you've got a few frigates. Well, whilst, yeah, you can out-frigate by providing value for money and presence and general, dispersion over a wide area, a fourth rate, fighting one is not a good idea. You might win. You might. Especially if you're a heavier frigate, you might win. Not saying you won't. But you also might lose quite badly, and there's probably going to be convoys of merchant ships which are around which are unattended, so why take the risk? They have a deterrence value which is out of all proportion to their actual military value. They also, in terms of deployment, are extra ships. They are extra ships. You have the 10 of them out. With their crews, slightly smaller than a third rate, slightly less numerous than a third rate, you can have those 10 wandering around, doing whatever you need them to do. Because, ultimately, if you put them in a fleet with a load of third rates, they're still going to be an extra ship of the line. They're still going to be an extra fighting asset. Not a great one, but if they were a third rate, maybe they tag team with the third rate against the first rate. That's quite as good as a pair of third rates tag teaming, but it might well work. It might well work. Ultimately, their capability, their strength, And the reason for their survival is that they present an outsized problem to the enemy by their existence. They are a strategic force multiplier. They are a strategic question your enemy has to deal with. And it's far more useful to have a couple than it is to not have any. And it's something which the largest power is going to do. The largest power is going to have enough money, enough interest, enough infrastructure in industry going on in this process to go, let's build 10 ships just to make sure everyone is slightly worried when they're trying to approach our convoys. And if you want to see this again in the history, there's Q-ship system. How to make the Germans worried about sidling up to a convoy. Have Q-ships. How we often talk about how it was stopped the German submarines going down the centre of convoys. It was having an escort sitting in the middle there. But that could still cause a lot of damage to the Germans doing that, unless. But the British also spent a lot of time publicising the amount of 4-inch guns that were now being fitted onto their merchant ships, and it didn't matter how many were ready there. The Germans were going to attribute any losses not to there being an escort sitting in the middle of the convoy now, but to the fact that there were these extra guns on these merchant ships. And so when you're going down the middle, yeah, you might start firing a gun and might hit one or two places, but all the merchant ships are going to start opening up on you. Yes, they might cause damage to each other, but the fact is the sheer volume of fire is probably going to cause damage to you, and that means you won't get home. Damaged submarines aren't getting back from the mid-Atlantic. So therefore you need to change your tactic. You need to change your tactic. Four freights are all about changing your thinking. They truly are the force multipliers of their era, because making use of them is about looking for value in them. Now, one of the first, arguably the first, built for the Royal Navy was HMS Adventure, built in 1646. When I say arguably the first, I was first built as an actual full freight, not as something else which is later put into the full freight category. And she's an interesting vessel with a fairly interesting but straightforward career. And before you ask, Alex, why are you doing a Royal Navy one of these ships? Why not one of the other navies you discussed? Well, honestly, it's because she was the earliest one I could find a decent picture of. Okay, that was it. Okay, I'm gonna hold my hands up here. I wanted a decent picture for this slide, and I looked at other navies. I looked through the Dutch, I looked through the Swedish, I looked through the French, I looked through every navy I could think of where you might find a drawing or a sketch or a picture. The earliest one I could find a decent picture of, which also went with a service life, which wasn't. We launched her. Turned out we'd overloaded her gun ports. She sank. We learnt our lessons. Was Adventure. So I'm not the one picking the slides here, or picking the Royal Navy here. It's fate and the number of drawings that are available. Okay, that's it. This is sometimes literally the picture selection for my slides in teaching or in YouTube. It literally goes to, this was the best picture I could find that serves to illustrate this picture, this role, and frankly, just giving a list of stats of my own hand drawing is not going to be good enough. I need something to back it up that's a good picture. So HMS Adventure, well, I'm going to call her an HMS Adventure, but for a large part of her life, she actually served with the Commonwealth Navy. And she's kind of interesting because she's actually rebuilt as a fifth rate in 1691. So let's think about it. She serves from 1646 to 1691 as a fourth rate, and then is rebuilt as a fifth rate in 1691. Roughly 45 years of service later. Now, let's think about it again, and think about... This ship will have been 45 years old when they officially just chopped her down and rebuilt her. And as that. And then, from 1691, she then would serve until she's captured by the French in 1709. So a further 18 years. 63 years of service from launch to loss. well, from commissioning and launching to loss. Having been ordered in December 1645 and built as part of the 1646 program pretty much in a year. You know what this tells me? This tells me three things. One, they'd already got the wood stockpiled, so frankly, in the nicest way, they'd been planning that a lot longer than a year, because otherwise you don't have the wood ready to go and frame. I know I'm starting to sound like a bit of a cynical, broken record on these things. It's like when people go, oh, I'm presuming the older figures for Royal Navy ships for their carrier speeds are correct on Wikipedia. They aren't under secrecy or things. And I'm sort of going, until you realise that a Royal Navy Admiral, not Fisher or Jellicoe, in 1904 wrote in a paper that wrote in a sort of letter to another admiral that he believed and was arguing vociferously in the service that they should only ever report the figures of ship speeds in terms of their performance under under normal service regulations, which basically transfers as peacetime, and in worse conditions. To put it as someone who likes to come on my channel puts it regularly, they can go to speed in peacetime maintenance and rules, and in all weathers. Yeah, pretty much. So that changes things, because what you're prepared to do to engines in peacetime, in normal service regulations, versus wartime, when war service regulations apply, well, they're different things. Because the end starts to justify the means a lot more if you're chasing down an enemy target in wartime, if you're trying to prevent the loss of a major convoy, or you're trying to win a naval battle. And I would say even today that probably still applies. Because once you're in the habit of it, you don't want to change that. And there's also another reason to do that. If you're the benchmark Navy and everyone is going to be setting their ships according to you, which the Royal Navy was prior to the World War II for about 150, 200 years. The Royal Navy was pretty much the benchmark Navy the rest of the world was. They would always be comparing their ships to what the Royal Navy equivalent was. That's the benchmark Navy. That's how you can tell the benchmark Navy. When the first thing out of their voice is, how's this compared to an Arleigh Burke? That tells you the US Navy is the benchmark Navy. That's the reality today. And in those periods, it was the Royal Navy which was the benchmark Navy. The thing is, if you're the benchmark Navy, that means that everyone's going to obsess over their performance compared to you. And if you want to affect everyone else's performance, the easiest way is to be precisely truthful about your performance figures. You don't want to tell a lie, you just want to be very precise in how truthful you are. So if you say your ship, well, their ships can do 35 knots. Well, that's true. Maybe they can do 35 knots. But in wartime, in peacetime, you wouldn't want to do that because, let's be honest, that's going to be overtaxing on your engines. We've already been over that wartime service versus peacetime service adds years onto the engine usage. Basically, the stat I often give is that 1 year of war is equivalent to 6 years of peace in terms of ship usage. That kind of suggests they are not using the engines the same way. If you can get 6 years of usage out of those engines for every one in peacetime, for every 1 year of war usage, that kind of suggests that in wartime you are absolutely tousing those engines anyway. You are absolutely caning them. I know this is slightly off topic for four freights, but we'll get back to it, trust me. There is a reason I'm going off this far and coming back to it. That was something you couldn't do in the Age of Sail. You couldn't hide about that. You couldn't lie about that. You couldn't lie about how fast your ships could do, really. They did the copper bottoming and these sort of things, but that gives you an edge, but doesn't give you a decisive edge. But you can do that in terms of steamships, in terms of steel ships, in terms of 1920s and 30 ships. It's more difficult to hide your armament, or what armament you have in those later ships, though, because they're in turrets, they're positioned. You might on outline look like a battleship or a cruiser or whatever, but, you know, it's far easier to work out where the guns are and how many they are. However, in this period, your guns are hidden behind cannon ports. You might have a full spread of guns. You might have both decks completely crewed. You might have one deck having landed its guns and being used as a troop ship to carry soldiers and their supplies. You might not be armed at all. You might be armed en flute with just a few guns. And you could be a fourth rate. You could be an East Indiaman. You all look very similar. Now, with this particular vessel, HMS Adventure, being 94 feet along the keel, having a breadth beam of 27 foot 9 inches, a depth of hold of 13 feet, that's pretty much 4 meters, and a draft of 13 feet 9 inches, so yeah, the hold is firmly underwater. If your hold is 13 feet and your draft is 13 feet 9 inches, the hold is automatically, the highest point in the hold is 9 inches below water. She's a deep running vessel, but she cost £2,618. This is before anyone starts saying that the Royal Navy could never get a ship for that price today. This is what we're talking about is in 1646. 1646. There's been a bit of inflation since then. Just a tad. Just a bit inflation. Now, she was commissioned in 1646, and she took part in the Winter Guard, which was a program whereby they had some ships active over the winter period. They usually laid up most ships into ordinary rather than having them keeping them in commission over the winter period, because, well, it saves money, but you need some in commission just in case something happens. You want to have a kernel of your fleet able, working, and just in case you need something. Oh, we need ships to go right now. That's Winter Guard. And then she moves to the Western Guard in spring. She took part in the blockade of Kinsale Island in 1648. And in 1649, she ends over to Scilly Islands in the autumn. She goes through a few captains in that time period as well. She's part of the Commonwealth Navy. She works with Robert Blake's fleet at Tagus in 1650. She took part in the Battle of Dover as a part of Rear Admiral Nehemiah Bourne's squadron. And, well, she did quite well there. She took part in the Battle of Portland as a member of Robert Blake's fleet of ships between the 18th and 20th of February in 1653. That's the victory which traditionally is considered to be what grants the English control of the English Channel and the right to name it. And that, of course, victory is over the Dutch. The Dutch lost 8 warships and 40 merchant vessels in that fleet. A few months later, after that, she takes part in the Battle of Gabbard as part of the Red Squadron, in the Van Division, under the command of Admiral James Peacock. And the British were sort of victorious on the first day, but... And when Admiral Tromp tried to reverse the fortunes of the battle, well, she was one of the ships which formed a line which held him off until Admiral Breaker arrived and forced Tromp to withdraw. And, of course, that then leads to the Battle of Schwengen, when she's also a member of Red Squadron under the command of Peacock. She did well. And then she would go off and escort colliers and do all sorts of operations. And then she carries on her service after the Restoration in 1661. And looking into this, I'm fairly sure she had a refit. She must have had quite an extensive refit at a couple of times. I am not 100% sure when, but she doesn't spend all the winters on winter guard duty, and I'm presuming it's one of the winter guard periods. Instead of being on guard, she is, when she's not on attached to them, she goes in for a major refit. Because a ship doing that long without a refit, normally you need some kind of heavy duty refit about every 10 years. Even in the age of in the wooden age of sail, normally, especially for a ship that's being as heavily used as she seems to be used. She seems to be regularly used on most winter guards. She seems to do roughly 4 out of every 5. So there are spaces, but the fact that she does the winter guard, she's still usually on duty throughout the year and is always mobilised for the squadron in this period. Shows you how useful she is, but also shows you that there must be some work going on to keep her going. Some work must be going on to keep her going. She participated in the Battle of Solbay, the Battle of Lowestoft, the Battle of Oxford Ness. She did all sorts of operations for the Royal Navy, and is a good example of what the four freights could get up to in this period and what they could be used for. She really is. But now we're at the Shameless book plug. This is the part where I get to say thank you. This is the part where I get to say thank you for your support. I get to plug my book because, well, I'm an academic. It's unusual for us to appear in front of any scenario where we don't plug our books. And most importantly, I get to say thank you for your support, because I wouldn't be here without it. I wouldn't be where I am in terms of the development of my research, in terms of the idea of I'm going to finish up at least one book thanks to the funding and that you gave me in the History of Fun, and that's going to help. That's going to help a lot, because hopefully they'll fund the second book, and then the second book will fund the third book, and maybe if all 3 books are doing okay at that point, they'll fund the 4th book, and that's the plan anyway. That's how we hope to roll it. It won't be every 3 months next year, but it'll hopefully build up. That's the aim. But it's all thanks to you that it's possible. Also, this is the point where I gotta go. Yeah, if you're noticing I'm wearing a fleece, which is not something I normally do, that's because I don't normally wear a fleece, but I am sensible enough, still getting over pneumonia, still going through the recovery period from it, that in a house where the heating is currently turned off, because the radiators are being changed over, and all that, and the piping between the radiators is being reorganised, because it was all one great big circuit for the entire house, and it's a sprawling bungalow which has had bits converted into habitable bits which weren't habitable bits and all sorts of things, and they just extended it rather than made sensible. It's had to be reorganised to make it work, and a draft, because that door still hasn't been fixed. I thought, I don't want to try and run the risk of making myself ill again. So if I manage to get the room warmed up, because I've turned on the electric radiator, I finally conceded that I should probably be sensibly turn on the electric radiator. I'll probably be back to normal by the time I'm live this evening, because it's Thursday when I'm recording this video. But you'll be able to tell if I wasn't able to get the temperature up to a sufficient point, because I'll still be wearing this. And well, let's start off with getting back to some nice history of the four freights. Now, Hindostan is one of perhaps the ultimate ironies, or one of several actually ultimate ironies, in that the Royal Navy in one period went, we need some four freights. Why? Because it's important for operational, and we're not going to mention the strategic ambiguity reasons, that we have some four freights. So what we're going to do, we're going to buy some East India Company ships and convert them into four freights. Literally, she was built as Hindostan for the British East India Company as one of their vessels, and she sold to the Royal Navy in 1795, and she serves in the Royal Navy till she's lost to fire in Rosas Bay in Spain, 2nd of April 1804. She'd been launched in 1789, so she is 15 years old, roughly. Roughly, heading to 15 years old when she dies. And she's a 56-gun 4-freight ship on the line. So she's a good vessel. A good, solid vessel. And if I give you an example of what she did with the Royal Navy, you know, she is known for really two things, and other than one of them is the fire and how she was lost and how well her crew managed the loss and what they did to survive. But also, she's known as the vessel which carried Lord Macartney on a special embassy to China. Although she technically did that when she was still an East Indiaman. Yes, the special government envoy on a special embassy to China went there on a merchant vessel. But let's be honest, it's the East India Company. They're a bit weird. And they also have the crews who are most experienced in sailing that part of the world, and do so most often, and do so as convoys. You either have to send out a very impressive warship to guarantee they get there solo, or you send out a couple of smaller, cheaper warships with the convoy going as extra escort, and you put on one of the bigger convoy merchant ships your ambassador, which is more cost effective. Now, her service then had been exemplary. But her service in the Navy, well, as said, that is typified by a lot of hard work. You know, she is one of those vessels which the Royal Navy really does make use of when they have her. She was purchased for £11,062, and when she's commissioned, she does a couple of months working up before she's scheduled to sail for Jamaica. During this time, she actually does, in a gale, get blown into the Santa Margarita, which is a 5th rate which had been captured from the Spanish. And the clash actually caused the Santa Margarita to lose her mast, bowsprit, and rigging, but Hindostan, yeah, she sailed within a month for Jamaica, so her damage was really kind of minor. She then takes part in operations in the West Indies, including at one point being commanded by Captain Francis Collingwood in October 1796. She was a guard ship at Plymouth in 1798, and then in December of 1798 she was commissioned as a 28-gun storeship for Cork. Now, you're thinking, hang on, Alex, you said she's a 56-gun ship. Well, you kind of guess what they've done. They've turned her into storeship/guard ship. She's still got some of her guns, so if someone tries to force their way into Cork, she's going to be able to add fire to defence. But she's also got a whole gun deck of space for storing stuff. It was her lower deck she gave up for storage, so maximising the storage stuff, and also allowing you to put quite a lot of heavy stuff down there. She then sailed from Mediterranean in 1800. Along with HMS Pearl, she captured a Ragusan ship, Velcourt, and which had a cargo of bale goods and cochineal, which is an interesting thing. They decided that the prize should be sent to the shared between the crews, and the crews actually shared a prize of £12,000 after there had been various submissions in various courts of prize. But yes, Hindostan and Pearl shared £12,000. Consider this ship was £11,000 to buy for the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy are purchasing some things, and there's various levels of getting money back, but there is £6,000 going to each crew. £6,000. More than half the cost of this ship to buy is going to be spread amongst the crews. That's a lot of money in those days. She's used as a store ship again for various other operations. But yeah, she has a good career. She has an active career. She goes to the Mediterranean. She goes to the Far East. She goes to Rio de Janeiro. She goes to the Caribbean. She does all sorts of operations. But her loss takes place in the Mediterranean. Hindostan sailed from Gibraltar in March 1804 to join Nelson off Toulon in company with the frigate Phoebe. She became separated from a gale and from Phoebe in a gale, and on the 2nd of April, about 30 miles southeast of Cape St. Sebastian, they found smoke pouring out of her. It was coming from the fore and main hatchways. They couldn't find a source of the fire. They couldn't find the flames. They tried throwing the ship's gunpowder overboard and made an attempt to flood the magazine. One was successful, one wasn't successful. The captain, Captain Lagros, had the boats prepared and hoisted out in case it was necessary to abandon the ship. He didn't want to be caught with the boats on the ship. He wanted to be able to get the boats off the ship for the crew as quickly as he could. As well as doing that, he also parades the Marines with loaded muskets in order to keep control of the situation. He's doing his best to prevent panic by both saying, look, I've got the situation in hand. You can see I've set things up for our escape so we can deal with this properly. But also, I've got these guys armed and fully loaded if there are problems. They will allow me to restore order at the point of a barrel if I need to. At this point, the crew continued throwing overboard not only whatever gunpowder they could reach, but everything else they could get hold of that they thought was remotely flammable. They fought the fire for about 7 hours, but whilst they were still 15 miles away from shore, flames started to erupt from the hatchways. Not just smoke, flames. They managed to still run the Hindostan aground in Rosas Bay. This was about a mile from Fort Ampiris and the Church of St. Peter, which were important points. But when she beaches, she's completely aflame, and locals are keeping well clear because they think it's going to be dangerous. It's going to go boom. However, the captain had not been silent. He had managed to make sure that not only did they have their own boats ready and to avoid to get the crew off, but they had improvised a raft to help others. And the ship's passengers and crew were saved shortly before the ship blew up. Some Spanish launches managed to ferry some of the ship's boat survivors from the ship boats ashore, and some of the boats managed to make it there. The order of rescue and the order of getting onto the boats had been women and children, ship's crews, officers, and the very last person to leave after personally checking the whole ship was Captain Lagros. Now, the evacuation was done very well, and there were only 3 men of the 259 people aboard, including passengers, lost. The court-martial includes not only a complete acquittal of Captain Lagros's officers, but it also praised them, and Admiral Nelson, famously quite picky on these things, remarked that the preservation of the crew seemed little short of a miracle. And that's a wonderful quote, by the way, that comes from him and is able to be found in Narratives of Shipwrecks of the Royal Navy between 1793 and 1849, written by William Octavius Shakespeare Gilly in 1850. Published by London John W. Parker. You can actually find, I think, a digital copy if you go hunting for it on Google. Yes, on Google Books. You can find a digital copy of it. Not sure how complete that is, but I think it's fairly good and fairly complete. The board also recommended under the actions that the acting Lieutenant Thomas Banks be promoted for his conduct to the wreck. Honestly, the court-martial was on the 19th of April. The events, as said, had taken place on the 2nd of April. His promotion to lieutenant was confirmed 23rd of June 1804 upon Admiralty receipt of letter from Nelson. For it to go through that quickly, that means Nelson pretty much sent the letter as soon as the court-martial's recommendation reached him. He didn't even think about it. He knew enough about the story about what happened that when the recommendation reached him, he just went, confirmed, send this to the Admiralty, and dispatched it as a forthwith. There are many who have different ideas about what could have caused the fire. There is occasional problems when hemp is wet. That when it's not completely dry and it's damp, that can cause fire. There's also medicine chests which can be loaded with things which can cause fire. There are lots of issues which can cause a fire on a ship. But this was a very well built ship, and as you can see, she survived for long enough to get her crew to this place she needed to be. But of course, while they are a smaller part of the Royal Navy, they are a larger part of other navies. Now, before we get into this too much details, I want to talk about the Delft here, which fought so well at Camperdown that the Royal Navy renamed the ship the Hercules, which was a Dutch ship they captured after the Battle of Camperdown, the Delft in its honour, because they felt the Delft had acquitted itself far more honourably, and they already had a Hercules. So you think about that, the Delft here is a 4th rate. The Hercules is a 64-gun 3rd rate. But yeah, they decide that the 4th rate did better. Now, Camperdown is an interesting battle because it's one of the times where the Dutch have some of the heaviest force structure they have, because quite often they have historically had quite a lot of 4th rates. These were good ships for them. These were very capable ships for them because of the waters they inhabit, or because of the realities of their admiralties and their organisation, the fact they often use their warships as merchant ships in peacetime or even in wartime, the fact that the difference between their version of East Indiaman and their core fleet is quite so porous. It's not even given the surface dressing the Royal Navy gives of purchasing it. Yeah, that makes for a very different circumstance. And again, for the Dutch, it's another thing of strategic ambiguity to make to them and make them such. Because if you want to make your convoys look strong, you make it difficult for your opponents to work out how many warships they have in them versus how many merchant ships. There are 60 large vessels in that convoy. Yes. 20 could be 4th rates or East Indiamen. Okay. So are there 20 4th rates there? In which case, it doesn't matter that we've brought like 3 3rd rates with us. This is not going to be a good fight for us to get in. They're going to be doubling up on us. Or have they got 20 East Indiamen? Or what's the variety in between? You don't know till you get close, and well, you don't even really know when they start firing at you, because let's be honest, the cannon soon obscured the side. So you're not really sure how many until you get very, very close. But at which point it's too late, you're committed and you can't get away. She'd taken part in several operations for the Dutch Republic and the Batavian Republic. She was ordered by the, I think it's, and I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, the Admiralty of the Meuse in 1782, and is commissioned in 1783 by the United Netherlands Navy. She sails against the Barbary pirates to protect Dutch trade ships, etc., in the Mediterranean in 1787. And then she does a voyage to Algiers, again, as part in 1793 for another, operation against the Barbary pirates. She does well in these missions. In 1795, when the French conquer the Dutch Republic and install the Batavian Republic, the French Navy initially decide that they would disarm the Delft because, frankly, they felt Orangist rebels would use her. But it's the Dutch themselves, the Batavian Republic, which would activate her for the war with Britain. And in 11th of October 1797, she takes part in the Battle of Camperdown. She was part of the fiercest, heaviest fighting in the battle. She's so badly damaged that even though they managed to... she does actually strike to the British and she is captured, she sinks off Schwingen 4 days later while being towed to Britain. As a result, as said, the Hercules gets renamed when it gets put into the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy feel that saying they captured the Delft and showing that off, that's far more status for the Royal Navy than the third-rate Hercules. They don't need another Hercules, but saying they took out the Delft, that matters. That matters. She was a good ship. She was a useful ship. She had 22 24-pounders on her lower gun deck, and she had 24 12-pounders on her upper gun deck, and she had a quarter deck and a forecastle which had 8 6-pounders between them. So yes, she's got 56 guns. Or rather, Pierce of 56 guns. Carries 54 guns in the usual fit, though. And at Camperdown, the four freights, as you can see, they make up a healthy number of the Dutch fleet. There are 4 of them there. There are four freights part of the Royal Navy fleet. Again, this is the thing about fighting in the North Sea, in the Baltic, etc. You tend to have some 4 freights with you. They're useful for those sort of inshore waters. They're just slightly shallower draft than a third rate and a second rate and a first rate, definitely. They're just slightly more viable for these things. Now, this Chesapeake Leopard affair. Now, I covered this before, but the point is often made that the American frigates are the equivalent of 4 freights, and to an extent they are, certainly in status. But in terms of combat, when they actually fight a 4 freight, they tend to not enjoy the experience. In fact, there's a constant theme throughout the War of 1812, this HMS 7 affair, which almost led to an earlier war and various other things, that the Americans really do not like fighting Royal Navy ships of the line. When a full ship of line turns up, they don't really have an answer for it apart from to get out its way. Doesn't matter if it's 4th rate, 3rd rate, anything above 5th rate is not really something they want to tangle with. And there's 2 good reasons for this. This is not speaking badly of the Americans. A, they don't have their own ships of line to cover for them and fall back with because of Congress. And B, there's the height advantage. A true 4th rate has 2 gun decks, which means rather like the height advantage of a 2nd rate versus a 3rd rate, they are firing down onto you. This gives them an advantage in the way the waves pitch a ship of the line around, in the way it rolls through the water. It also gives them an advantage in terms of firepower they can bring to bear in one space, on one angle. So yes, there are sensible reasons to avoid them. There are sensible reasons to do what happens here, where the Chesapeake meets HMS Leopard, gets tracked down by HMS Leopard and forced to hand things over. Leopard can force that. Leopard is powerful enough in relation to even, not the largest, but one of the better frigates of the US Navy. And let's be honest, Chesapeake goes on to a great career. She's not a bad frigate in the US Navy to go, this is not a fight I want to be in. This is not a sensible fight for me. Yes, on paper, I have a chance. But you know what? Having a chance on paper is worth exactly that. Paper. Is it worth your life? So this was another case where a 4th rate was very, very useful. Truly was very useful. And then we get to the Battle of Dogger Bank from 1781. Now this battle is amazing because both sides claim victory. Both sides have rather similar fleets involved in terms of their ships and structures. I've got a Dutch listed out here, but I can also talk through the British. Both sides are defending convoys, and the real priority is control of the sea in terms of being able to get your merchant trade through. The Dutch claim victory based on the ground that the British withdraw first. The British claim victory based on the grounds that their convoys kept going and kept proceeding, whereas the Dutch returned to Texel and just didn't leave harbour again during the war. That's a full and open debate. But the fact is, the Royal Navy came to the battle with pretty much three fourth rates and 4 third rates, split between a 64-gun ship, 2 74s, and an 80-gun ship on the third rate side. On the fourth rates, 44-gun, a 60-gun, a 50-gun, and a 60-gun ship. They had a nice mixture there. They had a really nice mixture going on under Admiral William Parker. The Dutch came to the battle with Effrins, a 54-gun fourth rate, Admiral General, a 74-gun third rate, Argo, a 44-gun frigate, Batavia, a 54-gun fourth rate, Admiral de Ruyter, a 68-gun third rate, Admiral Piet Hein, a 54-gun fourth rate, and Holland, a 68-gun third rate. So, a pretty similar mixture. Honestly, you were looking at this from a sheer gun perspective. You'd say the Royal Navy has this in the bag, but the Royal Navy and the Dutch are both protecting convoys. They're both leaving ships back with their convoys. The Royal Navy leaves Infanimia 32 guns, Tada 28 guns, Cabot 14 guns, Alert 14 guns, Leif 20 guns, Busy 14 guns, and Sprightly 14 guns all back there. The Dutch leave the Menelek, a 36-gun ship, Venus, a 24-gun ship, Spion and Zwolle, 16 and 10 guns, each. And they both bring other vessels along to back up their fleet. And again, the British bring more guns. But it does seem that the Dutch suffer more losses. The fight is interesting. Basically, as the convoys are doing their duties, the Dutch have decided to bust out of the blockade that the British had imposed on them due to their trading with the French and the Americans. And the Dutch are trying to get their trade through to the Americans at the same time as the British, with Hyde Parker, are trying to get their trade through to the Baltic, because the Dutch have been interfering with that as well. So you've got two convoys going past each other. And the thing is, the Dutch come out of Texel and end up going back to Texel. The British convoy ends up carrying on to where it was supposed to. It's a complicated scenario, truly it is, but it's also kind of an obvious scenario. Yes, the Dutch gain control of the battlefield, but that's because the British don't bother fighting it any longer than they need to. Because they don't think they're going to win. They don't think they're going to lose. They just think they're going to ground things out. And at this point in 1781, that's the worst thing the British can do, because every one of those ships they have is useful. So, they just keep fighting. They keep fighting, they do their business, and then they go home. And both sides claim victory. But it's the four freights which were important in this fight. And honestly, I would say that if both sides had allowed their larger merchant vessels to form up in their ship lines, or one side had, then you might have had a battle, because one side might have looked at the other and gone, wow, they've got an overwhelming superiority of ships. We should withdraw. And you've got enough four freights actually in the battle line that you could probably have got away with it. Probably got away with it. And that wouldn't have been the first battle the British had done that to the well, not to the Dutch specifically. They'd done it to the French before, but they could do it to the Dutch. And then we have HMS Isis, because I started off with one of the first of the Royal Navy's four freights. I had a look at trying to find what was probably the last for a four freight to be ordered by the Royal Navy. That's Isis. She's ordered in 1811. They launched in 1819. It's a 50-gun, two-decker Salisbury class. She was lengthened, as she was redesigned, and cut down under construction by one deck to produce a spar deck frigate. She carried the extra guns on the spar deck, which linked the forecastle to the quarterdeck, not a normal gun deck, which is why she retained the 58 guns. The plan had been to have the 58 guns, but, well, they decided, for various reasons, not at all to do with their own design and engineering, that 50 guns would be better. She's later reduced to a 44-gun frigate carrying 26 32-pounder guns in 1830. 12 more 32-pounders were on the quarterdeck and 2 were on the forecastle, together with 2 8-inch shells, which meant that realistically she had 42, but, you know, she's still very much in the frigate area with that tonnage and that number of guns. Shame for her. But no, she's probably the last ship to be designed to be a four freight for the Royal Navy, as officially called a four freight. Now, the four freights, as said, are the average in the middle, but they're also so general purpose, they're frankly, what do you do on them? I'd argue, to an extent, the Type 22 class became that, or frigates became a four freight kind of class. They weren't ships of line, they weren't the big ships, but they had the necessary presence and they had the necessary power to be good all-rounders. I'd argue, though, historically, four freights have usually been, when they have existed navies, have not been necessarily as large numbers as you would think to be looking for when you're considering them. They tend to be something which is produced in small numbers and fits in lots of holes. Trouble-class destroyers in World War II. They are pretty much filling the four freight role. They can step up or down in function, and either way they can be useful. So, with that being said, I've already done a question in past of think about what would be the four freight of today, or the four freight of every time period. So what I want you to think about is this. The four freights are the specialists, but not specialists. They're the specialist generalists. They fit squarely in the middle and everything. How about some definitions for the first, second, and third ships of the line? What would your definitions for them be? I'd be interested to see. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it interesting. And, well, what have we got coming up? We've got through entirety of the Year of the Aircraft Carrier, and for some reason I haven't added in the Christmas options. But they'll be coming, and honestly, if Thursday's live went to plan, I hope I announced the topics for December and January in terms of the premieres and the premieres and the lives. We'll hope I did that. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.